met with Diane to talk about the series of these talks, we talked about having different things that we wanted to go through. And last time round, Alex, who works in the clinic with me here in Surrey, did about behavior. But one of the things that we've been researching both with my group in Salford, where I have my research base, as well as things that we were seeing in clinic, is thinking about how brain issues link with postnatal life and how trauma affects that on top of it. But I want to start with a story. This is a story about an 11-year-old. So the 11-year-old was in an art class when they first went into senior school, which is the RE year 11. It was called year 1 then. The person basically who was in art wanted to draw the tree, and you could only draw the tree when you were being taught about 3D scanning and how to draw in sort of with distances, and you had to try and draw a series of flagpoles along the road. And no matter what that child would do, couldn't get the angle right. The teacher kept saying, your angles are wrong, you're not allowed to draw the tree. That 11-year-old was me. So what I've learned over the years that I have a visual processing issue, that I don't see lines seeing the same straight way. I've learned this because when we get a new test in the clinic, our psychologists practice on us. And so I've learned that actually I have a slight visual processing issue. I don't process visual images quickly. But the key issue is 30 years ago, sitting in a classroom, I still remember how my self-esteem was affected, how I didn't feel good about myself, how I went away feeling really disappointed that I didn't get to draw the tree. And that was something that to this day, 30 years later, no matter what I've achieved, you still remember the detail of. And what we talk about when we have those kind of things is that complex trauma issue. So in psychiatry now, we talk a lot about complex trauma. We talk about how life has layers of effect on top of your neurological functioning, and you need to understand it. So when we're thinking about this, and when we talk about FASD, when we think about how life is impacting on the individual and how subsequent life traumas impact them, you have to think of it not through how we see things, but you have to look first of all through their lens. And we're going to go through this in a little bit more detail. What's that typical development expectation? So the teacher sitting above me expecting to see the straight lines, and I just couldn't see it. And I was getting really upset I thought I was doing the job properly and I really wanted to move on, but you couldn't. And how even what people consider typically functional individuals compared to people who've got neurodevelopmental issues, how they're going to be problems. If you put the expectations of normally functioning individuals to people where you don't recognize their difficulties, what is that like for them? How does that affect their self-esteem? And how does that lead to behavioral difficulties, which we need to understand and manage? And those kind of stressors, the things that cause you to be upset, are the things that you need to understand. So a little bit of a recap first. FASD is a brain-related issue, and that's the first thing we have to understand. Whilst FASD is a brain and body disorder that affects all components, behavior, cognition, functioning is defined by how well your brain works. And very from the early days, looking at basically from scanning images, you can start to see that there are areas where there's preservation in the lateral structures, and you've got deficits in smaller head sizes and the brain in the frontal lobe. So frontal lobe pathology, midline problems, which are an issue. But what we also know is it's about how neural wiring goes on. And we know that in the third trimester, there are issues with neural migration, cells being in the wrong place. So what you have is a situation, can you see my pointer? Yeah, so cells where they should be, they're not where they're meant to be. So cells can be there, but if cells are not in the right place, you have an inefficient brain. And so what that leads to, on top of that, is deficits. And this is the corpus callosum. So this is the wiring in the middle of your brain. It's a white matter tract. It's like the freeway that goes from one side of the brain to the other. And if it's not there, or it's not functioning properly, what you have is the brain that is inefficient again. And so what you've got are hidden pieces of a midline brain deficit where things are not simply functioning. And these are the sort of the things that we start to see. But what's hidden is we don't look inside the brain. We don't have a scanner on top of them where we're constantly looking at those kind of factors. So this is the next two slides, again, from the CFAS study from Ed Riley. And what they look at, there's somebody got their microphone. I don't know if you could mute, because it's actually off-putting when you can hear people cooking in the background. Sorry. Thank you. So what you've got here is two sets of slides. The first set of slides is copying a shape with one hand. The next set of slides is copying the shape with your opposite hand. And you can see here there's no real difference with the normal hand. With the second set of slides, what you can see is there's a lot more effort put in for the person to copy with the other hand. What you don't see is a person external to them is the amount of effort that has to be put in to create the same thing. Both sets of groups and all groups completed the task. So externally observing, all you see is somebody who's completed the task. You're not seeing the effort that the brain is putting in. And so there is something about understanding the brain pathology. I want you to look at the top line here, just the top line. And so what you see here, this is a flashing light, loud noise. What you should do is normal participants, unaffected controls, respond to the flashing light. And so they have a less response to the loud noise. This is conditioning. And what you find here is this is an example of people not conditioning to normal, to expected behaviors. So their pattern of learning, that inefficient brain, means they don't process information in the same way. And so what happens is it takes longer to learn, it takes longer to habituate, it takes longer for them to function. And what we have is a situation where people external to them only see the person completing the task. They don't see the effort, they don't see the patterns, so they only see the difficulties with the behavior. And so those greater demands are unobserved. And it's only when you put challenges in that you start to see this. So this is an example from the clinic of what we call number letter sequencing in one of the tests. And what you should do is go 1A, 2B, and it's gone wrong straight away. This, to get to this level, you have had to do all the steps to get there. So the simple tasks they can do. So when you start to combine that, where you need the efficiency of your brain to work better, that things start to break down. And that's what you tend to see is that when you have, so a sequential task, A to B to C to D, where you do one thing, you go to the next thing, they can often do that. When you have to do parallel tasks, where you are holding here in your working memory, you're sequencing, you're shifting, and you're planning, that's where it breaks down. And that's been consistently shown across the world in multiple psychology tests. Carmen Rasmussen's group, Sarah Matteson's group, our group, we've all demonstrated that this is a basic issue with it. Now, the other thing to bear in mind, which is another factor which is affected in people with FASD, central structures again damaged, is that limbic system emotional regulation is a difficulty. And what we have here is the difference between testing in a clinic and testing in real life. So in a clinic situation where there is no wider stimulus, there's no emotional component, they often do well. And so they score better on basic psychometric testing. You put them into an emotional situation where you add in that emotional arousal, all of a sudden it doesn't work. Because then there's other factors going on to influence it, none of which is observable to the outside situation. And so you have to start off with what is the brain doing? How do we understand the brain pathology and understand the brain pathology unique to FASD to allow us to then start to get into how does the world affect them? Because they live in the world. And as we've shown, that living in the world changes how they function. And so that's an important component in when we're starting to think about brain environment, because we have to see the nature, but we have to understand how nurture and the environment can affect people's presentations. So how does that work? Now, when I first got into this, it was very much that you had to fall into one of the camps, either all to do with environmental factors or it's all to do with biological factors. And so that is partly what we have to always consider when we're thinking about these presentations. But the reality of it is it doesn't work like that, because the reality is not just that they are separate, but how they interface. And in fact, how they overlap in terms of the environmental factors linked to what's underlying it with a view to understanding what's going on. And that's where we need to start getting into to more detail. Now, if we think about attachment, and which everybody talks about in child rearing and all those kind of factors, and child adolescent work is very much based around this. All children will go through this at a certain rate. Now, some people may get stuck in different ways, but what we know is that there is a progression that most basically functioning and developing kids will have. Is you're born, all you need to do is be watered, fed, have your nappy changed, and be warm. And generally they're happy. You know, they don't want cuddles. That you want cuddles, they don't want cuddles. They just want to be kept warm and safe. By 6 weeks to 7 months, they want to be cuddled. They want to interact with you. They want to do it, but they don't care who they're interacting with. They don't care who's doing that. It's indiscriminate. By 7 months, if you do scans of babies, what you see is a lot of neural refinement. Your brain is being modified and you've got pathways starting to develop where you start to form initially specific attachments going along to multiple. And that's what people progress through when we're actually doing standard development. But what happens is we look at the environmental factors and we say here that babies' organization is related to parental factors. We don't take into account here what the child's response or the child part of the behavior is in any of this. And what happens is parents get blamed. So this was from my PhD where we did a parent study and there's certain people who may well have taken part. And what people say, how many have been blamed for being dysfunctional parents at some point? Everybody, 40 people I interviewed for this, every single one of them at some point have been blamed for being a bad parent. The bottom one was we did a long report for an educational psychologist. It wasn't agreed with by them, and they basically said it was all a road rubbish. Fetal alcohol doesn't exist. We're all making it up. Therefore, this is all to do with environmental factors. And the parents were sent to safeguarding. And so that's where they're saying that the parents are being abusive. Now, that wasn't true. But this is what happens, is parents end up being brained. Now, this was something we published in 2018, where we looked at the parental stress index. It started with a PhD, but we carried it on. And what you can see here is that when we look at those factors that influence the overall stress in the dynamic between parents and child, the factors that are inherent in the child, rather than the factors that are inherent in the parents, tend to have a greater influence on the two-way dynamic. Now, that doesn't mean the parents aren't part of that. What it's saying is by understanding the things like how the child deals with factors like being adaptable, being distractible, putting demand into the situation, accepting things, being rigid, they are more of the challenge than, for example, the parents being slightly isolated or the attachment issues or those kind of factors. They have less influence on the overall stress dynamic than those in itself. And so it becomes really important to think, well, what is the child-related factors? How is the child processing the world if we're going to understand it? And what we concluded is in the UK, specific consideration is given for carers of children with FASD. We might found the child's qualities are significantly impacted by the level of stress rather than the parent's ability to function as a parent. So you're not thinking in that dyad, what is the child in this? Because we don't look through their lens. We say it's the parent's fault rather than understanding the child is part of that dyad. And if we don't understand what the basic brain related factors are here and adapt to them, so it's not about different parenting, better parenting, it's about different parenting. It's not to say that good parenting can't make a difference, but those of you who are parents of kids here know you have to do it different. No, you don't do the same things that everybody else does. You have to parent differently. And that is by understanding your child and what your child needs, not saying they're the same as everybody else. And so going back to me, it's understanding actually, I may not see it different and I may have lines in a different way, but that means you've done your best to do that. Now go on to the fun bit so you don't feel bad about yourself. And so you feel a sense of achievement. And it's things like that that we need to understand. So one of the things that is there's 4 ways that people have reported that people can present and that people get missed. People have disability labeled that this was a piece of work that came out of intellectual disability work from a long time ago in terms of how thinking about people with an intellectual disability or neurodevelopmental disorders don't present with behavioral issues, is that they don't label their expression or their emotions, that they often present as being, it's called diagnostic overshadowing, where everything is put down to the FASD or to the link, rather than understanding it's a complex presentation, that they'd respond to stress in a way that actually is labeled appropriately, or that base behaviors that are always seen are mislabeled. And so what happens is that I came up with a phrase, which we did, is that to understand the relationship, what we have to look at is to say, well, what is the link between these things? And we talked about psychiatric onion because I like the image of layers of an onion. And first thing you have to do is to look at the neurodevelopmental issue. What is the understanding of the brain? Understand that. How does that then lead to that individual being vulnerable? And then how does the world influence them? Because then you can start to come out and say, well, actually, we know that their brain processes information differently. So therefore, putting them into this situation, which is good for a typically developing child, because they're vulnerable to this, to be more affected. And if we keep them there, they're going to be increasing in their stress and arousal as a result. And when we think about arousal, you need to think about a model whereby how do you understand those factors that are causing somebody to become distressed? How do we therefore understand the world that is leading to people being more and more aroused? And how can we manage that? So, for example, if somebody can't cope with noise or it's hyperstimulating, most classrooms I go to and have seen, I've got no noise reduction, lots of children making lots of noise, lots of stuff around all the walls, which is hyper stimulating, teachers talking to them in a way that isn't to them. And so all of this is causing increased stress. There's no adjustment for the way that the child processes language. So you need to slow down, like me not doing now. The fact that we have to give you information that you can cope with, that you can keep people on task, that we give you time out to learn, and that we actually reduce the sound if we need to, and manage your sensory system. So we're slowly bringing you down the ladder generally, so your ability to function and cope and manage that hot and cold executive function, you take the hot bit out and make it a better way for them to achieve their best. Because if you're not, and all you do is simply increase this by not talking to them correctly, keeping the sensory environment high, making sure that they're not giving them the instructions that they can cope with, just puts the stress up. And if stress goes up too much, that's when meltdowns happen. Is people can function, and there's things that happen in daily life, but if something major happens, they'll just flip into a situation where they can no longer cope. And at that point, they're just functioning and not thinking. So what you're trying to do overall is to keep the arousal levels lower, and so you can manage these kind of situations. And interventions are designed to be reactive to bring you down here, but really what you want to do is to prevent the event, the trauma being replayed, the problem that's occurred re-establishing itself. By keeping it low, what you're doing then is to try and manage that, so you actually keep the threshold below the point where aggression occurs, where people are functioning, their self-esteem is better, the dyad between parent and child functions much better. That's the principle, what you're trying to aim for. So we were interested in this area. So we've done a lot of work. So Alan Price, he's my PhD student, now doctor, as will have published in that. Some of you will have heard of him, some maybe not. But Alan's been doing a lot of work based on some observations that we had. And one of the big things looking at that neglect and postnatal life having an impact on people's presentation was done by the Romanian Orphanage Study. And they found that in a ratio of 60 children to 1 adult, that people who were left in sort of those situations for greater than 6 months had neurodevelopmental problems. In other situations, for example, the Tizard and Hodges studies below, that wasn't seen, but the ratios were far less. That there's something about, for example, is there a dose-dependent relationship here? And what we were seeing is a whole load of people who had just prenatal alcohol and good parenting, and a whole load of people who had a lot of postnatal bad experience as well, and wanting to try and understand how they lived. And when we looked at the neurodevelopmental outcomes between ADHD and ASD outcomes in that group as a comorbid presentation, there was no difference between people who were taken to care immediately or where there was no problems, people who had some neglect or protracted neglect. And if you look at sensory processing as another indicator of internal neurological functioning, again, no differences between those people who had neglect or no neglect. So we came to the conclusion that neurodevelopmental disorders, the brain-related factors, were independent of postnatal life, and that postnatal life didn't make that any worse. It did something else. So what did it do? And so that's where we needed the third group, the neglect group alone. And we didn't have that. But fortunately, Henry et al. Had done the piece of research in 2007, which had looked into the group of people with just trauma and neglect and those with both. And they found the same thing as us, is that the neurological brain-related issues were more likely to be seen with prenatal alcohol, but the psychological factors, the trauma, the impact of the teacher not listening to you, not understanding you, that was far more likely to be seen and experienced by those people who had been in more neglectful situations. So it's not to say that environment isn't affecting the overall behavior of the person you see, but they're doing different things. So rather than saying one thing or another causes, what you're trying to do is to slowly disentangle so you know the effect of each one. And that's what we need to try and do. What we do know, however, is that people are more vulnerable. And this was again part of Alan's PhD. And what he showed is that for people who have FASD, they're more likely to experience adverse experiences compared to typically developing children. Now, whilst physical and sexual abuse was more common in typically developing children, there were still high rates in those with FASD. And when we look across the board, all of these studies all agree that people with FASD are far more vulnerable, but that an early diagnosis and understanding the child and adapting to the child can help. Now, if you look at the Dinkler study at the top, that's actually done in people with autism. And so what they looked at was a group of the Swedish cohort study led by Chris Gilberg, and they've identified the same thing as us, is that effectively what you have is a situation where those people who had autism were more vulnerable to abuse, but abuse didn't cause autism. So it goes back to the fact that the brain comes first, then the environment influences how that individual, because they're all different, is affected, and how that then leads to the behaviors that we see, the things that set people off, the triggers that upset people. They are all stimulated by your experiences of life around it in terms of how that brain works. And it's sometimes the unobserved issues. So the teacher, for my case, not knowing that I didn't have my visual processing issue, compared to, so if anybody ever wants to play Dongle with me, which is a game, you'll beat me because I can't do it well because of that. It takes me longer to process visual things. And it's the same thing. If you don't understand the individual and you don't put things around them, you're going to affect their self-esteem. They're going to not want to do that because they know and don't want to feel bad. Nobody wants to feel bad. And that's part of the issue. And when we think about these kind of factors, if we don't have a brain that is functioning well, then the roots of attachment, the roots of healthy relationships are going to be affected. And you improve that by understanding what's going on in the brain, scaffolding that, and then allowing these things to develop. And so that's what we need to try and do. As an example, and we're nearly finished now, and this is the last thing, is what happens is people talk about the brain, they miss the brain. What they have is a poor understanding of what's going on inside, because all they see is the pattern of behavior, and they see a disturbed child who's being blamed for being disobedient, blamed for being willful. They go and see a psychiatrist and it's labeled as conduct disorder. They become an adult, it's named as a personality disorder. They end up in section or whatever. And so they end up in the health system rather than have an understanding. Now, if you change that paradigm and you start off saying, actually, we understand the brain. We understand there are issues here because we've diagnosed FASD. We understand that their communication may be a problem, that they can't process language quickly, that we need to do things slowly or give them pieces of information in small chunks. What you then do is the people around them adapt. We give them information in a way that they can cope with. So a simple thing such as, we're going out, get your coat, should be, get your coat, we're going out. But what people do is that they know that the correct routine should be, you don't go outside before you've put your coat on. Whereas actually the person with FASD has heard you say, we're going out, so they're standing outside waiting for you to leave. And what we do is we get angry is why they haven't got the coat. rather than understanding that we have made the mistake. And what we should be doing is saying, get your coat, then we'll go outside. Actually, what you should do is say, go and get your coat. When they've got the coat, then you say, we'll go outside. But by changing and adapting to them, the quality of life is better for both parent and child. The disability is understood and supported, and so self-esteem maintained. The quality of the experience between the dyad is much better, and that's what you're ultimately hoping for. Because when we talk about complex trauma, it's about understanding things from the perspective of that person, not our perspective, from their perspective. So we have to be the ones who are empathic towards what's going on. We need to understand them and what the life has done and what is happening. We need to be the ones who are compassionate towards them. We need to understand how their brain processes that information, and then you can start to put in things that can modify that. Because if we don't, what we're doing is perpetuating or even creating trauma. And so that's part of the thing that we need to be aware of if we're going to manage that. That's my clinical team. That's the book that sort of Joe said. It's recently come out. It is designed for clinicians to come back and to refer to. You know, this came out in September. I didn't set the price, unfortunately, but it is available if anybody's interested. And I've finished with 4 minutes to spare, which for me is pretty good, actually. So I'm going to stop there.